The Wall Street Journal reported that Secretary of State Marco Rubio had a commission tasked with working out security guarantees for Ukraine. Now, according to the publication, these measures include 4 key components: a foreign military presence on Ukrainian territory. This would likely be headed by European countries and the EU. Deployment of air defense systems on Ukrainian territory, continuing to arm Ukrainian military, and control over the cessation of hostilities. Basically, they'd be keeping watch over the front lines once a ceasefire took place. Now, this commission, the potential establishment of this commission follows the Alaska summit that took place last Friday between President Putin and President Trump, and the subsequent meeting with EU leadership and Zelensky and President Trump on Monday. Now, neither one of these discussions really yielded anything groundbreaking, but there was one key concession that Trump made, and that's that he's dropped the idea of a need for a ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine. He's basically said, well, we don't need a ceasefire. We can negotiate a long-term sustainable end or peace treaty to this war. And I think that's a positive development. They're not requiring a ceasefire to take place before negotiations start the way they have been over the past couple of months. So that's a pretty good development. Now, whether Trump will follow and his administration will follow through with establishing a long-term, durable, sustainable peace between Russia and Ukraine is questionable. I don't think that they've given the impression, at least to me, that they want to invest the time, the energy, and the resources into a long-term, sustainable, and durable peace. It would take a lot of time. There are a lot of questions and technicalities that need to be answered and addressed between both sides. And I think that both sides are too far apart right now for anything like that to happen. So all 4 of these steps related to this commission directly contradict Russia's basic demands, right? And so it's just kind of like what I said. It's great that Trump wants to establish a long-term peace between Ukraine and Russia so that the war doesn't start again. But if this commission is eventually established and headed by Marco Rubio related to security guarantees, it's already completely flying. The components and what they're going to be addressing already contradict, the basic demands that Russia's basic red lines, right, for ending the conflict. So all 4 steps related to this commission directly contradict Russia's basic demands: no foreign troops, no arms supplies, limitation on Ukraine's armed forces, and no ceasefire agreements until peace agreements are reached. And now both the American establishment and Trump personally continue to demand Russia's actual capitulation and refusal to satisfy or acknowledge demands, or in all seriousness, the root causes that Putin continues to bring up. And this is the crazy thing about the meeting that took place on Monday. Number one of the things I observed was that, and this was before the meeting took place. So this weekend I was thinking, why are the European leaders coming with Zelensky in the first place? That was bothersome. And then it was clarified that they didn't invite themselves. The Trump administration actually invited them, but I still said this is really they're going to throw a wrench in the little bit of progress that you've made at the summit in Alaska. I mean, they're going to poison pill any kind of negotiations that happen in the future and the progress that was already made. And so they came and they did bring up repeatedly, again, a ceasefire and security guarantees. And this is, again, why this commission is allegedly going to be established to discuss security guarantees. But in doing this, they're just basically contradicting or ignoring everything that the Russians are requiring to get the peace process moving forward. So the West, I think, is in the Western Europe, the Europeans and the US, I still believe isn't ready to reckon with The Russians, and they're demanding capitulation by taking these actions. The only difference is that under Biden, these demands were presented as an ultimatum, and now they're wrapped up in conciliatory tones and rhetoric. And from an administration, honestly, that should not be trusted because of the constant shapeshifting and the lack of strategy, right? Sometimes the shapeshifting and, being vague about intentions can be helpful, staying guarded and this kind of thing. But this isn't hidden from anybody. When the Europeans come, Zelensky comes, they're still demanding security guarantees. They're still saying the same things that created roadblocks over the past couple of months for anything progressing when it comes to a peace between Russia and Ukraine. So this is again from the Journal. It says, quote, Trump rules out putting U.S. troops on the ground if a deal is reached to halt the war. And this was never really said by Trump. I think he alluded to it during his meeting with Zelensky on Monday about, American troops being on the ground, but he never really committed to that. I think that some media outlets in the West basically read too much into the statement that he made. He said Trump signaled on Tuesday that the U.S. is prepared to use air power to support a European security force in Ukraine, but ruled out deploying American ground troops. When it comes to security, they're willing to put people on the ground, Trump said. We're willing to help them with things, especially probably if you talk about air, because there's nobody that has that kind of stuff that we have. And you can take this with kind of a grain of salt. Likely Trump will change his mind on this. I don't know that we can take this too seriously about him wanting to use air power to guard the European troops should they ever go to Ukraine. And talks won't move forward if this is kind of like the poison pill. If this is something that Zelensky and the Europeans insist on, talks won't move forward with the Russians because they don't want European troops or peacekeepers and American air power over Ukraine. And what they're saying is that what the Russians are saying and what they've been saying is that they want to share in the security guarantees. They want to be a part of the security guarantees that are given to Ukraine. And we'll get into that a little bit later. But the article goes on, planning for the multinational force to be sent to Ukraine if a peace settlement is reached accelerated on Tuesday, a day after Trump discussed the idea at the White House. After Trump's summit with his Russian counterpart in Alaska, the president tasked Air Force General Dan Kane, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, to develop options for NATO-like security guarantees for that force. NATO-like security guarantees, non-starter, American air power over Ukraine, non-starter. These are all non-starters for the Russians. So again, I ask myself, are they serious? Is the administration serious after this, seeming small breakthrough on Friday? Are we serious with some of these things, some of these discussions? And the Russians, certain officials have already rejected all of these ideas. The planned force faces a number of major diplomatic challenges. While Trump has said he expects Putin of Russia to accept the presence of Western troops in Ukraine, Russia has objected to the idea. Trump didn't specify the role the U.S. military might have in providing air support to a European ground force, whether it would include warplanes, air defense systems, or surveillance drones. The Pentagon could deploy aircraft outside Ukraine to protect European troops, including jet fighters, to aid European forces in the country if they are attacked, or surveillance drones to monitor any peace agreement. Now that's probably something that will take place, drones to monitor any kind of peace or, halt in hostilities once that time comes. The U.S. could also fly European troops and equipment on its cargo planes, provide ground-based air defense systems to the European, and contribute military intelligence. Following the White House meeting with top European leaders on Monday, Secretary of State Rubio will start working with the Europeans on plans for a security guarantee for Ukraine. These guarantees could include, this is key, a potential promise to back up Ukraine modeled on NATO's Article 5. Anything resembling Article 5 of NATO will be a non-starter for the Russians, obviously. That's the trigger clause. And that's the idea that if one country that's part of NATO is attacked, then the U.S. will intervene on behalf of that country. All the countries will will respond. And of course, as has been said several times before, there's a lot of questions around the Article 5 provision in that NATO abides by. But any security guarantee that resembles Article 5 is going to be a non-starter. And so this is part of the response from the Russian side. This is from Reuters. Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov was very critical of some of these developments, and in particular, he criticized the role of European leaders who met President Trump and Zelensky at the White House on Monday to discuss security guarantees for Ukraine that could help end the war. Lavrov said in particular, Russia was in favor of truly reliable guarantees for Ukraine and suggested these could be modeled on a draft accord that was discussed between the warring parties in Istanbul in 2022. And we've discussed the 2022 meeting in Istanbul. And essentially, the Russians are wanting a part in any kind of, like I said earlier, in any kind of security guarantees that take place. And that was hashed out in the Istanbul Accords in 2022, where Russia would actually participate with Germany, France. I think it was Germany and France that brokered that with the Russians and Ukrainians, where they would all share in the security responsibility for Ukraine. But the problem that the West has is that would give Russia veto power over any future actions that are taking place relative to the pact. So at the time, Kiev rejected the proposal on the grounds that Moscow would have held effective veto power over any military response to come to its aid, which, if I'm not mistaken, that's not the reason. This was the Istanbul situation was in 2022, right after the war had started in March of that year. And both sides, the Russians and the Ukrainians, had reached this agreement, and they were both going to sign the document. But then, of course, as many of you have probably heard, Boris Johnson came and torpedoed those negotiations. Sergei Lavrov continues, we cannot agree with the fact that now it is proposed to resolve questions of collective security without the Russian Federation. This will not work. Lavrov told a joint news conference after meeting the foreign minister of Jordan. I'm sure that in the West, and above all in the United States, they understand perfectly well that seriously discussing security issues without the Russian Federation is a utopia. It's a road to nowhere. Lavrov's comments highlighted Moscow's demand for Western governments to directly engage with it on questions of security concerning Ukraine and Europe, something it says they have so far refused to do. And this makes sense. Ukraine obviously is in Russia's backyard. Why would they not have any kind of guarantee? And I know people would say, well, it's because they started the war. But again, if you go into the history of the actual causes of this war, security was always the issue. And had that have been addressed properly decades ago, then the war wouldn't have started. So this week, Moscow also restated its categorical rejection of any scenarios involving the deployment of NATO troops in Ukraine. And so it seems, kind of to sum things up, that Putin and Trump had sort of an uneventful meeting, but it was productive in the sense that Trump walked away from this requirement for a ceasefire before negotiations could start. But immediately after that, the European Union decided they were going to try again to poison pill any progress that was made between Trump and Putin. Zelensky, of course, was in tow to all this. And this is unfortunate, right? Trump has said repeatedly that these negotiations in the future, any kind of peace treaty that's established, is going to be very complicated to work through and to manage once it is established. And it makes it that much harder that Trump has got the Europeans nipping at his heels at every turn, and he can't just work with Putin and Zelensky, right? Europe does have an interest in all of this, in many of these negotiations, but it shouldn't be a primary one. They should really be sidelined until the US, Ukraine, and Russia can work something out. because it's just adding a headache to the whole situation. And as Rubio and Witkoff alluded to this weekend, perhaps they want the Europeans there. Maybe they just want to offload this completely to the Europeans in Ukraine, which would actually be a good idea. But it's going to be a long process if this is what we're going to have to deal with. We're going to have to listen to the Europeans chirping because they're afraid of Russia. And then we're going to have to listen to Zelensky and Zelensky's nationalists in Ukraine chirping. And then you have to deal with Putin. It's a lot to deal with. And unfortunately, I don't think that Trump has the desire or is cut out to really manage all of these moving parts. And many in this administration, I don't believe, share this sort of neutral position towards Russia and Putin that Trump does. There are a lot of these people are all hawks and neocons. So I stand by my claim that I made in the last video that sanctions are inevitable and there will be no trilateral meeting between Trump, Zelensky, and Putin anytime soon. I think this is much of what we've seen over the past couple of days has been more theater. And largely, I'm not thinking there's going to be any kind of summit between the three parties because they're just too far apart. Their objectives and what they're looking for are too far apart. I think that it'll eventually happen. But not anytime soon. Definitely not, especially with the way the battlefield is shaping up right now, with Russia continuing to gain on the battlefield. Now, if air support for European troops on Ukrainian soil happens in any scenario, we will have reason to be disturbed and alarmed by that. If American air power is deployed over Ukraine in any scenario, right? And honestly, I don't think that Trump would write it off completely, but you never know. But we're probably not going to hear anything about that kind of security guarantee in the near future because we're so far apart on just the basics. So the nature of security guarantees and them being discussed in these working groups right now between the U.S. and the European leaders in Ukraine it's too premature. And I think it's impossible since that's, again, a red line that Russia has. They probably want a lasting and durable peace. This is the final thing I'm going to say, but I think what they want more is a PR victory, this administration. And of course, Nobel Prizes and this kind of thing. And in that sense, I don't think this is about wanting the killing to end. So that's our update on the Russo-Ukrainian war. And we're going to continue to monitor it. A lot of things are said, a lot of things happen. I cover it once in a while because honestly, much of it is nothing, right? As I said at the beginning of the video, the biggest key over the past week has been the concession to drop this requirement for a ceasefire before negotiations can start. So thanks for joining me.